The morning was quiet in the barracks, the kind of quiet that made every scrape of the broom sound louder than it should, each swish echoing across the long rows of empty bunks. She was just sweeping, her hands moving automatically, her mind drifting in the rhythm of the bristles against the floor. Dust gathered into little piles that caught the faint sunlight leaking through the high windows, but no one really noticed her there, not the officers who passed by, not the recruits who hurried in and out with their boots stomping and their voices sharp with commands. She had been invisible for as long as she could remember, the girl who cleaned up after the soldiers, who made sure the barracks were spotless before inspection, who stayed quiet when men in uniform shouted or laughed too loud, who blended into the background like part of the furniture. Her work never stopped, and she had accepted that because it was safe to be unseen, safe to be the one who held no power. But on that day, everything shifted in a heartbeat when the heavy door slammed open with a sound that made her jump and tighten her grip on the broom. A man walked in, not like the others, not with casual noise or weary steps, but with a presence that filled the room, controlled the air, made her suddenly aware of every breath she was taking. He wore the gear of a Navy SEAL, dark and precise, his uniform carrying the marks of someone who had been places she could only imagine, places where dust was mixed with blood, where silence was as dangerous as sound. His eyes swept across the room, sharp, calculating, and then landed on her, the only figure there. She froze, her broom hovering midair, her heartbeat quickening as though she had done something wrong. He didn't say a word at first, only studied her, and then with a motion so swift it startled her, he reached behind his back and pulled something out. It was a weapon, heavy and matte black, and without hesitation he extended it toward her, the steel glinting faintly under the Barrack lights. She stared at it, her mouth dry, her throat tight, not understanding why a man like him would hand her something like that. She was nobody. She was just the girl sweeping floors, the one nobody saw, and yet here he was, holding out a gun as if it belonged to her, as if he expected her to take it. Her hands trembled on the broom, her thoughts scrambled, panic rising in her chest. She shook her head, trying to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He spoke then, his voice low but commanding, carrying the weight of someone who had lived in fire and shadow. Take it. Just 2 words, but they cut through the air, undeniable, unshakable. She felt the world tilt in that moment, the floor under her boots no longer steady, the broom no longer an anchor but a useless stick in her grip. Slowly, almost against her will, she lowered it, her fingers reluctant to let go, and then reached out with her other hand, hovering just short of the weapon. It felt wrong, it felt impossible, but there was something in his eyes that rooted her to the spot, something that told her this was not a choice. Her fingertips brushed the cold metal, and she shivered, then wrapped her palm around the grip. The weight dragged her arm down instantly, heavier than she had imagined, not just in steel but in meaning. He released it into her hand and she staggered slightly, clutching it awkwardly like a child holding something far too dangerous. She wanted to drop it, to scream, to ask why, but before she could speak, he leaned closer, his gaze locking with hers, steady, unflinching. "The time for sweeping is over," he said, each word precise, deliberate, as if spoken from a place of knowledge she could not yet understand. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The barracks no longer felt like a place of routine and chores. It felt charged, alive, ready to explode into something she could not predict. She glanced down at the weapon in her hand, then back at him, and for the first time in her life she was not invisible. He had seen her, chosen her, placed something in her grip that could change everything. And in that silence, as dust motes drifted in the beam of sunlight, as the broom lay forgotten on the floor, she realized that her world was no longer the same, that whatever came next, she could never go back to just sweeping floors. Her fingers clenched around the weapon as though it might vanish if she loosened her grip, the weight of it pulling at her wrist while her heart pounded so loud it seemed to echo in the emptiness of the barracks, and still she could not look away from him, this stranger who had entered her world like a storm and placed in her hands something she had never imagined holding, something forbidden and terrifying and powerful all at once. She wanted to shove it back at him, to shout that this wasn't her place, that she was nothing more than a cleaner, that weapons belonged to soldiers and warriors and men like him, not to invisible girls who swept floors, but the words refused to come, lodged in her throat like stones, and he seemed to sense her resistance. Because he took a single step closer, his shadow falling across her face, his eyes drilling into hers, not unkind but relentless, as if he could see past every excuse she had ever clung to, every lie she had told herself about being small and unworthy, and he spoke again, calm but firm, his tone carrying a gravity that left no room for argument. "You're stronger than you think." The words struck her harder than she expected, as if he had reached into her chest and pulled out something hidden, a spark she had buried long ago, and suddenly her mind filled with flashes of memory, of nights spent outside the barracks listening to the gunfire from distant drills, of whispers among the soldiers about battles fought overseas, of the way she sometimes dreamed of breaking free of her invisible role, though she had always pushed those dreams away as foolish. Now, with the weapon heavy in her hand and his gaze steady upon her, those buried thoughts surged to the surface, wild and frightening. She shook her head, finally forcing out a whisper, her voice trembling, "I can't. I don't know how." His mouth curved, not in a smile but in something like acknowledgement, as though he had expected that answer, and without a word he reached for her wrists, steadying her arms, guiding the weapon upward with practiced ease until it was pointed straight ahead, his hands firm but careful, not forcing, simply showing, and she gasped at the sudden alignment, at the realization of how natural it could feel to hold it like this. "It's not about knowing," he murmured near her ear, his breath low and warm, "it's about deciding." The phrase sent a chill down her spine because it sounded less like instruction and more like prophecy, and she struggled to comprehend what was happening, why he had chosen her, why now, why here. Outside, faint voices echoed down the hall, distant footsteps moving closer, but he didn't look away, didn't let go of her arms, and for a moment she felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this small point of connection between them, the weapon bridging two very different lives. The sound of boots drew nearer, and suddenly the door burst open again, 3 men in uniform rushing in, their voices loud and demanding, their eyes locking on the scene before them. The girl with a weapon clutched awkwardly in her hands and the seal. Standing so close he might have been the one holding her up. Confusion and suspicion crackled in the air as one of them barked, "What the hell is this?" Her instinct screamed at her to drop the gun, to throw it down and run, to vanish the way she always had, but before she could move the seal's hand tightened slightly on her wrist, grounding her, steadying her, and he answered for her, his voice level but unyielding, "She's with me." The words shocked her almost as much as the weapon itself, because they carried a claim, a protection, a shift in identity she had not asked for yet could not deny. The other men exchanged glances, disbelief and unease flickering across their faces, but none dared challenge him outright. His presence carried authority that outweighed their hesitation, and after a tense silence one of them muttered something under his breath and stepped back, the others following reluctantly. The seal held her gaze again, ignoring the retreating figures, and then finally he released her arms, letting her feel the full weight of the weapon on her own. Her knees trembled, her breath shaky, but she did not drop it. Not this time. She looked down at the steel, then up at him, and for the first time she realized there was no going back, that by simply accepting his outstretched hand, by allowing the weapon to rest in her grip, she had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed, a line that separated the invisible from the seen, the powerless from the chosen, and though fear still clawed at her chest, something else had begun to stir beneath it, something that felt dangerously close to strength. She stood frozen in the silence that followed, the weapon still heavy in her grip, her arms trembling but unwilling to let it fall, and the seal's steady eyes remained locked on her as if he were silently measuring the decision she hadn't even realized she was making, the decision to hold on instead of giving in to the instinct to cast it away, and in that quiet moment she understood that his choice to hand her the weapon had not been random at all, that he had seen something in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for, something even she had spent years denying, and the thought both terrified and electrified her because it meant she could no longer pretend to be invisible, no longer hide behind her broom and her silence, no longer live unnoticed in the shadows of other people's lives. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and finally found her voice again, whispering barely above the hum of her own heartbeat, "Why me?" He didn't answer right away, just studied her with a gaze that made her feel as though he were stripping away every layer of doubt she carried, and then he said simply, "Because you don't know how strong you are yet." The words lingered between them like a challenge, and she wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong, that she was fragile and ordinary and had never fought for anything, but before she could speak the distant sound of alarms erupted, sharp and shrill, cutting through the barracks and sending a jolt of fear straight through her chest. Red lights began to flash across the walls, and the seal's expression shifted instantly from calm to focused intensity as he turned toward the door, his body tense, every muscle alert, the weapon in her hand suddenly no longer a strange burden but a necessity pressed into her palm for a reason she had yet to grasp. She panicked, glancing at the door as boots thundered in the corridor and voices shouted urgent commands, the air filling with the unmistakable weight of danger closing in. Her instinct was to run, to hide, to drop to the floor and disappear the way she always had, but the seal snapped his head back toward her, his voice cutting through the chaos with that same unshakable authority, "Stay with me." Something in his tone anchored her to the spot, and when he moved she moved too, her legs carrying her forward before her mind could catch up, the weapon still clutched awkwardly in her hands as he led her swiftly out of the barracks and into the wide hall beyond. The flashing lights cast everything in a surreal glow, shadows racing across the walls, soldiers rushing past with rifles ready, their faces tight with focus, and she realized with a surge of dread that this was not a drill. Something was happening, something real, something dangerous, and she was caught in the middle of it without warning. Her breaths came short and quick as she stumbled to keep up with him, her heart pounding in rhythm with the alarms, and yet a strange clarity began to form beneath the panic, a clarity born of the knowledge that the broom had been taken from her hand for a reason, that she had been pulled into this storm because hiding was no longer an option. He guided her through the hall with swift precision, moving like a man who had memorized every corner, every exit, every path to safety, and though she barely understood what was happening, she clung to his presence like a lifeline, because if anyone could navigate this chaos it was him. Soldiers glanced at her as she passed, confusion flickering in their eyes at the sight of the cleaning girl clutching a weapon like she didn't belong, but none of them spoke, none dared question the seal beside her, and that silence only deepened her sense that she had crossed into a world she was never meant to enter. They reached a stairwell, the sound of boots above and below, and he motioned her forward, his hand briefly pressing against her shoulder, firm but steady, guiding her like a commander would guide a soldier, though she still felt like a fraud, like she was pretending to be something she wasn't, until he spoke again, his voice low but urgent. "You don't have time to doubt yourself. Whatever happens next, you keep your head clear. Do you understand?" She nodded without thinking, her throat too tight to form words, and as they climbed the stairs together she realized with startling force that his faith in her was not something she could cast aside, not when the world around them was unraveling, not when the alarms screamed and the shadows stretched long, not when the weight of the weapon in her hands was no longer just steel but the possibility of survival. She tightened her grip, pushed her legs to move faster, and for the first time in her life she wasn't sweeping up after other people's battles. She was walking straight into one that the stairwell vibrated with the pounding of boots, voices shouting orders that blended with the wail of the alarms, and she kept her eyes on the broad back of the seal in front of her, his movements controlled and precise even in the chaos, his hand sometimes lifting to signal her when to slow or duck, and though she had no training, no understanding of what exactly was unfolding, her body obeyed his wordless commands as if some instinct she had never known she possessed was waking inside her, guiding her footsteps, steadying her grip on the weapon that still felt strange but less alien with every passing second. They emerged into a dim corridor lined with reinforced doors, the air heavier here, the tension thicker, and for a moment she wondered if she should speak, ask him what was happening, but before she could he stopped abruptly, his hand shooting out to press her against the wall, his body shifting protectively in front of hers as shadows appeared at the far end of the hallway. 3 figures moved quickly, armed, their uniforms unfamiliar, their presence wrong, and the sudden realization hit her like ice. This was not an exercise, not an accident, but an intrusion, the kind of threat she had only overheard in hushed rumors among the soldiers. Her heart leapt into her throat, fear choking her as the seal raised his weapon in a fluid motion, his stance solid, his focus absolute, and he glanced back at her only once, his eyes meeting hers in a silent command that said everything. "Stay calm, stay ready, don't break." She swallowed hard, her knuckles white around the weapon, and before she could even process it, the hallway erupted in noise, gunfire shattering the silence, sparks leaping from the walls as bullets tore through the air. She flinched, dropping low, her body screaming to curl into the smallest shape possible, but his steady presence in front of her anchored her, reminded her that she wasn't just a bystander anymore, that she held in her hands something that could mean the difference between life and death. The intruders advanced quickly, returning fire with ruthless precision, and she watched as the seal moved like liquid steel, his every motion efficient, deliberate, terrifyingly effective, each shot he fired striking with purpose. And yet the enemy didn't falter, pressing forward with a determination that made her chest tighten with panic. One of them broke off to flank, slipping along the wall toward her side, and in that instant she realized with a cold jolt that he was coming straight for her, not him, not the seal, but her. Her breath caught, her mind screaming to freeze, but then his earlier words echoed through her skull, "You're stronger than you think," and something inside her snapped. Her arms lifted, clumsy but driven, the weapon rising into place, and before doubt could crush her she squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her entire body, the sound deafening in her ears, and for a heartbeat she thought she had missed, but then the intruder stumbled, his advance breaking, his weapon clattering against the floor as he dropped heavily against the wall. The shock of what she had done ripped through her, her knees almost giving out, but the seal's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Good, again if you have to." It wasn't praise so much as affirmation, the recognition that she had crossed a line and could not turn back, and even as her stomach twisted, even as fear battled with disbelief, she steadied her arms, forcing herself to remain upright, forcing herself to be more than the invisible girl she had always been. The firefight raged for what felt like an eternity, though in truth it lasted only minutes, and when at last the final intruder went down, silence rushed in so suddenly it was almost painful. Smoke curled in the air, the walls scarred, the floor littered with spent casings, and she realized she was trembling all over, the weapon hot and heavy in her grip, her lungs dragging in air that didn't feel like enough. The SEAL turned, lowering his weapon, his eyes scanning her quickly as if checking for wounds, and when he saw she was unhurt his expression shifted, softer for just a breath. "You did it," he said quietly, and though his tone was calm, she caught the edge of something else there, respect. Her throat tightened, her voice lost, and she could only nod, though her mind screamed in disbelief at what she had just done, at how far she had come in such a short, impossible span of time. But there was no pause, no time for her to collapse into shock because he straightened, listening to something distant, some signal she could not hear, and then he motioned her forward. "We're not finished. Come on." And despite the weight of fear still pressing down on her, she found her legs moving, her grip steadying, because she understood now that she was no longer sweeping the barracks, no longer invisible, no longer a ghost in the shadows of other people's lives. She was standing in the line of fire, and for reasons she still couldn't grasp, she was meant to be there. Her footsteps echoed unevenly as she followed close behind him, her hands still trembling though she gripped the weapon tighter now, no longer out of fear of dropping it but because some instinct told her that letting go would be more dangerous than holding on. And the farther they went the more the barracks transformed around her from the place she had once cleaned every morning into something unrecognizable, a war zone lit by flashing alarms and littered with chaos, voices shouting orders, boots pounding, soldiers rushing past with grim urgency, their expressions betraying that whatever was happening was far bigger than the firefight she had just survived. She tried to process the images flashing before her eyes, soldiers carrying wounded comrades on stretchers, debris scattered across the corridor from an explosion that must have shaken the building minutes earlier, the acrid bite of smoke filling her nostrils, and yet through all of it, the SEAL moved with unshaken purpose, cutting through the madness as though every path had already been laid out in his mind, and she clung to his presence like a compass because without him she would have been swallowed whole by the confusion. At one corner he paused suddenly, raising a hand to halt her, his eyes narrowing as he listened, and she froze, her chest heaving with the weight of adrenaline, waiting, straining her ears though all she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse. Then without a word he pushed open a door and ushered her quickly inside, closing it behind them to muffle the noise of the corridor. The room was dark, lit only by a faint glow from emergency panels, and she blinked until her eyes adjusted enough to make out the shapes. Racks of weapons lined against the walls, crates stacked neatly, the air thick with the metallic scent of ammunition. Her breath caught as she realized they were in an armory, and for the first time she fully understood how far she had been pulled from the life she had known only hours earlier. He moved swiftly, checking crates, loading fresh magazines, his hands working with mechanical precision born of years of repetition, and then he turned to her, his eyes sharp even in the dim light. "You need to learn now," he said, tossing her a magazine that clattered awkwardly against her palms, heavier than she expected. She fumbled, almost dropping it, but managed to hold on, staring down at the dull metal object like it might explode in her hands. "Load it," he instructed, and when she shook her head, her voice breaking in a desperate whisper, "I don't know how." He was suddenly in front of her, guiding her hands again just as he had in the barracks, his fingers sure and steady as he showed her the motion, how to lock it into the weapon with a solid click. "Like this," he said, his voice firm but patient, and he had her repeat the action until her shaking hands grew steadier, until the motion no longer felt like a foreign ritual but something she could replicate without thinking. Every time the magazine locked in with a snap she felt another wall inside her break down, another piece of the invisible girl fading away, replaced by someone she didn't recognize yet couldn't deny was real. He stepped back, watching her carefully, his expression unreadable, and then he asked, "Do you understand what this means?" She swallowed, her mouth dry, and managed to nod, though her voice betrayed the fear still clinging to her bones. "It means I can fight." His gaze softened, though only slightly, and he shook his head. "It means you must choose. To fight or to fall. There's no in-between." The weight of his words settled over her like a cloak, suffocating yet empowering, because she understood that he wasn't just talking about this moment, about the battle echoing outside the armory. He was talking about her entire life, about the truth that she had hidden behind sweeping in silence, about the choice she had never dared to make until now. Before she could answer, the muffled thud of another explosion shook the walls, dust sifting down from the ceiling, and the door rattled violently, voices shouting from the other side. Her chest seized in panic, but the SEAL had already raised his weapon, his body shifting into that unshakable stance, and with a swift nod he motioned her to take position beside him. For a heartbeat she wanted to collapse, to beg him to protect her, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility, but the broom she had left behind seemed a lifetime away now, a symbol of a world that no longer existed, and so she stepped forward, lifted her weapon, and stood beside him. Her hands were steadier than she expected, her legs still shaking but rooted firmly to the ground, and in that moment she felt something powerful unfurling within her, something raw and fierce, as if the fear itself had burned away to reveal a fire she had never known was there. The door shuddered again, the hinges groaning, and she tightened her grip, her breath slow and deliberate, waiting for whatever came through. Knowing that the choice had already been made, the door burst inward with a deafening crack, splinters flying, and before her mind had even caught up her body reacted, her finger tightening on the trigger just as the SEAL had taught her, the recoil jolting through her shoulders as the first figure stumbled into the room, his weapon raised, his voice lost. In the eruption of gunfire that filled the armory, she had thought she would freeze, thought the panic would paralyze her, but the sound that left her throat was not a scream but a ragged exhale as the shot connected, the intruder dropping hard against the floor, and though her hands trembled the weapon stayed firm in her grip, as if it had fused with her will. The SEAL moved beside her with lethal precision, each shot he fired calculated, controlled, the rhythm of a man who had lived inside battles for so long that the chaos became a kind of order, and she tried to mimic him, not with his grace or certainty but with the desperate clarity of survival. More men poured through the door, their uniforms mismatched, their eyes hard with intent, and the fight blurred into a storm of noise and flashes, every second stretching into an eternity where she no longer had time to doubt or think, only act. Her ears rang, her chest burned, but every time she thought she couldn't hold on she felt his presence near her, a shadow of strength that steadied her, and that was enough to keep her going. One of the intruders lunged too close, an instinct overrode training she didn't have. She swung the weapon like a blunt instrument, the butt crashing into his jaw with a crack that reverberated up her arm, and as he collapsed, pain flaring in her wrist, she realized with a strange, horrifying clarity that she was surviving not by accident but because some part of her had finally woken up. The last man dropped with a final echo of gunfire, silence crashing into the room like a wave, broken only by her ragged breaths and the ringing in her ears. Smoke curled upward from the barrels, mingling with the acrid stench of spent rounds, and she found herself shaking, her knees threatening to give way, but she didn't let go of the weapon. Not this time. She turned her head toward him, her chest heaving, and he was already watching her, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding something she hadn't seen before. Not just calculation, not just command, but a flicker of approval, as if she had proven something to him, though she didn't even know what. He crossed the floor, his boots crunching on scattered casings, and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "You held," he said, his voice low, almost drowned by the ringing in her ears, but the words cut through clear enough and she swallowed hard, nodding even though her throat felt raw. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice hoarse, and for the first time he allowed the corner of his mouth to lift in something close to a smile. "No one ever does," he replied, and then his tone hardened again, his focus shifting as his gaze darted toward the still open doorway. "But now you know you can." She followed his eyes, the fear creeping back in as she realized the fight wasn't over, that this skirmish was just a sliver of whatever larger storm had descended upon the barracks, and before she could ask what was happening he was already moving, reloading with fluid efficiency, his every motion screaming urgency. "We can't stay here," he said, glancing at her to make sure she understood. "There will be more." Her stomach tightened, but she nodded, because the broom she had once clung to for safety was gone forever, and in its place was this new, terrifying reality where hesitation could cost her life. He pushed her gently toward the door, leading the way into the corridor again, and as they stepped over the fallen intruders she forced herself not to look at their faces, not to think about what it meant, because if she did she would break and there was no room left for breaking. The hallway beyond was eerily quiet now, the alarms still pulsing but the flood of soldiers thinning, and with every step she felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest, the line she had crossed pulling her farther from the person she once was. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the disbelief, there was a current of something else, something sharp and alive, something that whispered she was not as powerless as she had always believed. She kept close to him, matching his pace as best she could, the weapon still clutched in her aching hands, and though every part of her longed to collapse, to surrender to exhaustion, she pressed forward, because in this new reality the only choice left to her was to keep moving. The next morning began without ceremony, without even the sound of boots striking the ground or the echo of laughter that sometimes punctuated the silence of the barracks. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the entire compound held its breath. Nadia woke on her narrow cot, the thin blanket tangled around her legs, her mind already calculating what the day might bring. She had learned in these last weeks that the life of the SEALs was never predictable, never guaranteed to be routine. Every sunrise meant either grueling drills or the sudden call to something real, something dangerous. She sat up slowly, brushing a strand of loose hair from her face. When she swung her legs to the floor, she noticed the space in the corner where Ethan's weapon had been cleaned the night before. It was gone. He had already taken it with him, probably into the yard for inspection. That small realization hit her harder than she expected. She was not part of their world in the way he was. She was still the outsider, the one who swept floors until fate and an unexpected gesture had put a rifle in her hands. But she was no longer the same girl who had walked into the barracks weeks ago, broom in hand. Every scar on her palms, every bruise earned during training, every bead of sweat that stung her eyes had carved her into something new. She stood, stretched, and walked out to the sunlight, where the others were already gathered. The men stood in formation, but this time something was different. At the center of the yard, a transport vehicle idled, its engine rumbling low, the metal catching the morning light. Beside it stood the commander, his expression hard, his arms crossed. Nadia knew something serious was unfolding before anyone spoke. Ethan caught her eye across the yard, his expression unreadable, but in his gaze there was both warning and reassurance. "Listen up," the commander barked, his voice cutting across the yard like a whip. "We've received intel of a situation developing on the northern ridge. It's not a drill. This is live." A ripple moved through the group, almost imperceptible but heavy with weight. Real missions were not discussed openly in front of civilians, but Nadia realized with a jolt that she was no longer being treated as one. She was standing there, shoulder to shoulder with the men, the commander's eyes sweeping across her as though daring her to flinch. "You're going with them," he said, finally settling his gaze on her. The words struck her harder than any blow. For a heartbeat, her breath caught. She had trained, yes. She had pushed herself through exhaustion and fear, but the idea of leaving the relative safety of the compound, of stepping into the unknown battlefield, was something else entirely. She didn't even have time to question it before Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "She's ready?" The commander arched an eyebrow, studying Ethan, then Nadia. Whatever silent evaluation took place in that moment ended quickly. "Then gear up," he ordered. The SEALs moved like a single organism, breaking formation, collecting weapons, strapping on armor. Nadia found herself swept into the rhythm, her heart hammering in her chest, her hands trembling as she tightened the straps of the vest Ethan had handed her. He moved beside her, checking the fit, adjusting the sling on her rifle, his hands firm and sure. "Breathe," he murmured so only she could hear. "Don't think about what's out there. Just stay close, listen, and remember what you've learned." She nodded, unable to find words, her throat dry with adrenaline. The sound of boots stomping up the vehicle ramp filled her ears. One by one, the men climbed aboard, and then it was her turn. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before following Ethan inside. The interior was cramped, dimly lit by strips of red light. The men checked their gear in silence, the air thick with focus. Nadia sat wedged between Ethan and another SEAL whose face she had never seen soften with anything resembling humor. She could feel the hum of the engine through the metal floor beneath her boots, could hear the rattle of equipment as the vehicle jolted forward. Every bump in the dirt road sent a jolt through her body. Her fingers curled tightly around the grip of her weapon, her knuckles pale. She stared at the floor, forcing herself to breathe evenly, to quiet the rush of fear surging through her. Across from her, another soldier caught her eye. He gave her a small nod, just a fraction, but enough to steady her. It was the first acknowledgement she had received from him in all these weeks. The ride seemed endless, every passing second winding her nerves tighter. When the vehicle finally ground to a halt, the silence inside was deafening. The rear hatch opened, flooding the compartment with harsh sunlight. Dust swirled in the air, carried on a dry wind that stung her eyes. The men filed out quickly, weapons raised, movements sharp and precise. Nadia followed, her boots hitting the earth with a dull thud. The landscape stretched wide before her, a mixture of jagged rocks and low scrub, the ridge rising in the distance. Somewhere out there was the reason they had come. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was real and it was dangerous. "Stay tight," Ethan's voice whispered near her ear. His presence was the only anchor she had in that moment. For the first time since this all began, Nadia understood that she was no longer on the edge of their world. She was in it, walking into whatever waited beyond the ridge, the line between who she had been and who she was becoming dissolving with every step forward. And as the unit moved, silent but unstoppable, she tightened her grip on the weapon and matched their pace, knowing there was no turning back now. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, the air charged with anticipation. News channels had swarmed the building since morning, their cameras lining the steps outside, eager to capture the end of what had become one of the most controversial HOA disputes in the country. At the center of it all stood Karen and Captain Sarah Morgan, the veteran whose calm defiance had turned a petty neighborhood quarrel into a battle for respect, justice, and dignity. Sarah adjusted her uniform jacket as she walked into the chamber. Though she had left active duty years ago, the discipline and pride never faded from her. Every step was measured, shoulders squared, eyes steady. People in the gallery whispered her name with admiration, while others craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman who had silenced Karen time and again with facts, patience, and strength. Karen, however, was a different picture altogether. Her face was tight with frustration, her usual bravado barely holding. She sat with her lawyers, flipping nervously through a folder of papers. The weeks had not been kind to her. Her reputation in the community was ruined, her leadership of the HOA shattered, and even her allies had begun to distance themselves. But still she clung to the fight. Losing was not in Karen's vocabulary, even when she stood on the edge of total defeat. The judge entered and silence fell. Everyone rose, then sat again. The gavel struck once. This court is now in session. Today we will hear final arguments before delivering a ruling in the matter of Sarah Morgan versus the Lakeside HOA, represented by Karen Ellison. The lawyers presented their cases with fire and polish, each trying to frame the events in their favor. Karen's side painted Sarah as a disruptive neighbor who refused to follow community guidelines. Sarah's attorney countered with documents, video evidence, and testimonies from residents who had witnessed the harassment firsthand. But when all the arguments were done, the judge did something unexpected. He looked directly at Sarah. "Captain Morgan," he said, "before I issue my ruling, I'd like to hear from you directly. You've been at the center of this conflict. Do you have anything you wish to say?" The room hushed. Sarah stood slowly, her boots clicking against the polished floor. She faced the judge, but her words were meant for everyone: Karen, the HOA, the community, and the watching world. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I served my country for 20 years. I faced enemies, endured hardship, and put my life on the line so that people back home could live free. When I retired, all I wanted was peace. I bought my home near the lake because it reminded me of calm places I'd seen in distant lands, places worth protecting. But the moment I moved in, I was told I didn't belong. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because I didn't fit someone else's idea of control." Her eyes turned briefly toward Karen, whose jaw tightened.